The morning sun peeked through the grand windows of Courtroom 7 as Judge Marcus Chen adjusted his glasses, preparing for another day of cases. His reputation for fairness and attention to detail had earned him respect throughout the legal community, though some whispered he could be a bit too quick with his decisions. The ancient wooden benches creaked under the weight of dozens of waiting citizens, each clutching their paperwork and rehearsing their explanations in hushed whispers. The marble walls seemed to amplify every small sound, from the gentle tapping of the court clerk's keyboard to the occasional cough from the back row. At 52, Judge Chen carried himself with the precise dignity that came from 15 years on the bench. His salt and pepper hair was always perfectly trimmed, his black robes pressed to perfection, and his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually spotless. The morning light caught the small American flag pin on his lapel, a gift from his father when he first passed the bar exam. "Good morning, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and courtesy. "Welcome to the Municipal Court of Manhattan. Traffic Division. We have a full docket today, so we'll proceed efficiently." His eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar mix of frustrated faces and nervous energy that filled his courtroom every Monday morning. Sarah Thompson, his trusted bailiff for the past decade, stood at attention near the judge's bench. She had already sorted through the morning's cases, placing them in order of complexity, a system she and Judge Chen had perfected over the years. The thin manila folders were stacked neatly, each one representing a story, an excuse, or sometimes a genuine misunderstanding. The first few cases moved along smoothly. A delivery driver with an expired meter, a student who misread a parking sign, and a tourist who failed to move their rental car during street cleaning. Judge Chen handled each with his characteristic blend of efficiency and fairness, though his colleagues often teased him about his assembly line justice. The morning light continued to strengthen, creating long shadows across the courtroom floor. The wood paneling along the walls seemed to glow with a warm honey color, contrasting with the stern formality of the proceedings. Outside, the bustling sounds of Manhattan's morning traffic provided a constant backdrop to the quiet drama unfolding within. Judge Chen paused briefly to sip water from his silver tumbler, another daily ritual that his regular attendees had come to expect. He glanced at his watch, a vintage Omega that had belonged to his grandfather, a reminder of his family's journey from immigrant shopkeepers to respected professionals in just 2 generations. The crowd in the courtroom had thinned slightly as cases were resolved and dismissed. The remaining attendees shifted in their seats, some checking their phones discreetly, others reviewing their documents one last time. The air conditioning hummed softly, keeping the room comfortable despite the growing heat outside. As he prepared to call the next case, Judge Chen noticed a slight commotion at the back of the courtroom. Someone had just rushed in, slightly out of breath, and clutching a leather portfolio. He couldn't quite see who it was yet, but there was something different about this entrance, something that made several heads turn and whispers start circulating. Little did he know that this seemingly ordinary Monday morning was about to become one of the most memorable days of his judicial career. The next case would challenge his assumptions, test his professional demeanor, and ultimately lead to an unexpected turn of events that would make headlines across the city. A petite woman in her 40s hurried into the courtroom, her navy blazer slightly wrinkled and her auburn hair escaping its neat bun. Sarah Mitchell apologized softly for her tardiness, explaining she had been delayed by an unexpected meeting. The judge merely nodded, having heard countless similar explanations. The click of her heels echoed against the marble floor as she made her way to the defendant's table. Despite her rushed appearance, she carried herself with an unmistakable air of quiet confidence. Her leather portfolio, though obviously well used, spoke of quality and professionalism. Several observers noticed that while she seemed somewhat flustered, her eyes remained sharp and alert. "Case number 247, announced the court clerk, shuffling through his papers with practiced efficiency. "Parking violation in a restricted zone, December 15th, at approximately 9:45 am. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as Judge Chen peered down at the documentation before him. Sarah Mitchell stood straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Unlike many others who appeared before Judge Chen, she didn't fidget or show signs of nervousness. Instead, she maintained a composed demeanor that seemed slightly out of place in a routine traffic court session. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Chen began, his voice carrying its usual Monday morning weariness, "you were cited for parking in a restricted zone outside the federal building. The officer's notes indicate your vehicle remained there for approximately 17 minutes. Do you understand the nature of this violation?" Her response came in a clear, measured tone that caught the attention of several court officers. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the nature of the violation, but I would like to explain the circumstances if I may." She reached into her portfolio, producing a small stack of neatly organized papers. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor. A young law student, observing from the back row, found himself particularly interested in this case, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way the defendant carried herself, or the subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere since her arrival. Judge Chen glanced at his watch, his patience wearing thin after a morning of endless excuses. "Ms. Mitchell, while I appreciate your preparation, I've heard numerous explanations today about urgent meetings and pressing circumstances. The restricted zone exists for security reasons, not convenience." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom as Sarah Mitchell opened her mouth to respond. The court clerk had paused in his typing, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. Even the bailiff seemed to be paying more attention than usual to this seemingly routine case. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice maintaining its professional calm, "I understand the importance of security protocols. However, on the morning in question," she was cut short by Judge Chen's raised hand, a gesture familiar to regular attendees of his court. The air in the courtroom felt heavier somehow, charged with an undefined tension. A few more people had trickled in, including a court reporter who usually didn't bother with traffic cases. Something about this particular case seemed to draw attention, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Sarah Mitchell's expression remained unchanged, though those sitting closest to her might have noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. She carefully placed her papers back in her portfolio, her movements deliberate and controlled. The morning light caught the edge of what appeared to be an official government ID card peeking out from her folder, but Judge Chen was already looking down at his own papers, preparing to issue his ruling. The case seemed simple enough. A parking incident near the federal building during a high-alert situation. Judge Chen listened to the beginning of her explanation about an emergency meeting, but following his usual efficient approach, swiftly moved to issue his ruling. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Chen's voice carried across the hushed courtroom, "the citation clearly states that your vehicle was parked in a zone clearly marked as restricted. The signage is prominent, and security measures around federal buildings are not suggestions but mandatory requirements." He adjusted his glasses, a habit that regular court attendees recognized as a prelude to his final decision. The morning light now streamed directly through the tall windows, creating a dramatic effect as dust motes danced in the golden beams. Several observers noticed how Sarah Mitchell remained perfectly still, her posture suggesting patience rather than resignation. The leather portfolio rested on the table before her, still unopened after the judge's interruption. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, warming to his topic, "These restrictions were put in place for the safety and security of all citizens. Your meeting, however urgent, does not supersede these carefully considered protocols." He shuffled the papers before him, his movements precise and deliberate. A young intern in the back row scribbled furiously in his notepad, sensing something unusual about this particular case. The regular rhythm of traffic court had subtly shifted, though he couldn't quite identify how or why. Even the usual background noise of Manhattan traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was paying attention. Sarah Mitchell's fingers rested lightly on her portfolio, her silver rings catching the sunlight. "Your Honor, if I could just explain the nature of the..." But once again, Judge Chen raised his hand, silencing her mid-sentence. His expression remained stern, though those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tension around his eyes. The court clerk had stopped his typical rapid typing, his hand hovering over the keyboard as he watched the scene unfold. The bailiff shifted slightly, her usual stoic expression giving way to one of curious interest. Something about Ms. Mitchell's calm demeanor seemed to command attention without demanding it. Given the serious nature of this violation, Judge Chen declared, his voice taking on the formal tone he reserved for pronouncing judgments, and considering the current security climate, I am imposing a fine of $500. He reached for his gavel, prepared to make the ruling official. A subtle change rippled through the courtroom. The morning light seemed to dim slightly as a cloud passed over the sun. Sarah Mitchell's expression remained unchanged, though a careful observer might have noticed her straighten almost imperceptibly. Her hand moved toward her portfolio, but before she could open it, movement near the judge's bench caught everyone's attention. The regular hum of the courtroom air conditioning provided a soft backdrop to the proceedings, but even it seemed to fade into silence as Thomas, the court clerk, suddenly rose from his seat. His movement was unusually abrupt for the normally sedate atmosphere of traffic court, and several heads turned to watch his hurried approach to the judge's bench. Judge Chen's hand, holding the gavel, paused midair as he noticed his clerk's urgent approach. Thomas's face wore an expression that seasoned courtroom observers had never seen before, a mixture of concern and something that looked surprisingly like suppressed amusement. In his hand, he clutched a small blue notepad, its pages fluttering slightly with the speed of his movement. The morning sun emerged from behind its cloud, flooding the courtroom once again with golden light, just as Thomas reached the judge's bench. The moment seemed frozen in time, like a photograph capturing the instant before a significant revelation. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's clerk, Thomas, rushed forward with remarkable speed, nearly tripping over his own feet. He handed the judge a small blue notepad, his eyes wide with urgency. Judge Chen's confident expression froze as he read the hastily scribbled message. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as Judge Chen's complexion shifted through several subtle shades. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he lowered the notepad, and for the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he seemed at a loss for words. The morning sunlight caught his face at an angle that highlighted the beads of perspiration now forming on his forehead. "Your Honor," Thomas whispered, though in the silent courtroom his words carried further than intended. "Perhaps we should review the defendant's full credentials before proceeding." His voice held a note of gentle warning that caught the attention of the seasoned court reporters in attendance. Judge Chen's eyes darted between the notepad and Sarah Mitchell, who remained standing with remarkable composure. The portfolio before her now seemed to take on new significance, and the partial glimpse of an official ID card, peeking from its edge, suddenly appeared far more important than it had moments ago. The regular court attendees, who had witnessed thousands of cases in this very room, sensed the shift in atmosphere. The usual background sounds, the shuffle of papers, the quiet whispers, the distant echo of city traffic, all seemed to fade away as everyone focused on the unfolding scene before them. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Chen finally managed, his voice carrying an entirely different tone than before, "I believe we may have acted somewhat." Hastily, he carefully placed the blue notepad face down on his bench, as if it contained state secrets rather than a simple identification note. Sarah Mitchell's expression remained unchanged, though those closest to her might have noticed the smallest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her hands remained folded calmly on top of her portfolio, her posture neither defensive nor antagonistic. The morning sun chose that moment to emerge fully from behind a cloud, flooding the courtroom with brilliant light. It created an almost theatrical effect, highlighting the judge's now flustered expression and the quiet dignity of the woman standing before him. Thomas hovered anxiously beside the bench, his usual professional demeanor slightly ruffled. The other court officers had begun to pick up on the tension, and several shifted closer to the front of the room. curious about what could have caused such an unusual reaction in their typically unflappable judge. Perhaps, Judge Chen continued, removing his glasses and carefully wiping them with his handkerchief. We should hear your full explanation of the circumstances. His voice had lost its earlier authoritative edge, replaced by something that sounded remarkably like respect tinged with apprehension. The younger observers in the courtroom looked confused by the sudden change. But the veterans, the lawyers, the regular court officers, the experienced reporters, began to show signs of recognition. Whispers started at the back of the room and worked their way forward like a gentle wave. Sarah Mitchell simply nodded, her composure unbroken. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd maintained throughout the proceedings. "Though I believe your clerk has already provided the most relevant information." She gestured slightly toward the face-down notepad that seemed to have transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Judge Chen's hand moved unconsciously to adjust his tie, a nervous gesture that hadn't been seen in Courtroom 7 for many years. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become the talk of the entire courthouse. Sarah Mitchell's gentle smile never wavered as the truth emerged. She had parked briefly while racing to provide crucial information for a national defense meeting. As a third-term Congresswoman serving on several important committees, she could have mentioned her position immediately, but chose not to. The portfolio on the table before her finally opened, revealing a collection of official documents bearing congressional seals. "Your Honor," she began, her voice maintaining its earlier calm, "I was responding to an urgent summons from the Joint Committee on National Security. Time was of the essence, and I made a calculated decision knowing the potential consequences." Judge Chen's expression shifted between professional composure and genuine surprise as Congresswoman Mitchell explained the circumstances. The morning sun caught the official congressional pin on her lapel, previously hidden by the fold of her blazer. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom as observers noticed the distinctive golden eagle design. "The information I carried," she continued, gesturing to her portfolio, "required immediate attention. While I respect the parking restrictions and understand their importance, I had to weigh the immediate national security needs against standard protocols." Her explanation remained measured, without a hint of superiority or defensiveness. Thomas, the court clerk, had returned to his station but couldn't help stealing glances at the scene unfolding before him. The regular click of his keyboard remained silent as he, like everyone else in the room, found himself captivated by the remarkable turn of events. "Of course," Congresswoman Mitchell added, drawing a document from her portfolio. "I have official verification of the emergency meeting and my required presence. However, I want to be clear that I'm not seeking special treatment. The fine, if you still deem it appropriate, will be paid in full." Her words carried the weight of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. The morning light created a gentle halo around her auburn hair as she stood, somehow managing to appear both authoritative and humble. The younger interns in the back of the courtroom had their phones out, though court rules prevented them from taking pictures. This was a moment they knew they would want to remember. Several senior attorneys present for other cases exchanged knowing looks. They had witnessed countless defendants try to talk their way out of tickets, but this situation was unprecedented. Here was someone with genuine power choosing not to wield it until absolutely necessary. "Congresswoman Mitchell," Judge Chen finally spoke, his voice finding its professional rhythm again. "Your commitment to equal treatment under the law is admirable." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "However, given the verified circumstances of national security, this court finds that your actions were within reasonable emergency protocols." The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of having witnessed something remarkable. The regular sounds of the courtroom gradually returned, the shuffle of papers, the whispered conversations, the distant city noise filtering through the windows. Sarah Mitchell gathered her documents with the same careful precision she had shown throughout the proceedings. "Thank you, Your Honor," she responded, her smile genuine but professional. I appreciate your consideration of all the facts. Perhaps this incident can serve as a reminder that sometimes situations aren't quite what they initially appear to be. The sunlight continued to stream through the courtroom windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air like tiny stars. Judge Chen noticed that despite the revelation of her identity and the dismissal of charges, Congresswoman Mitchell's demeanor hadn't changed from her first steps into the courtroom, a testament to the character that had carried her from a small town to the halls of Congress. The local news teams, who typically found traffic court mundane, suddenly sprang to life with their cameras and notepads. The story of the humble Congresswoman and the surprised judge began spreading through social media channels, touching hearts across the nation. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in growing numbers as word spread through the city's media circles. Janet Martinez, a veteran court reporter who had witnessed the entire scene, already had her laptop open on a nearby bench, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she captured every detail of the remarkable morning. "It was unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of covering the courts," she said into her phone, speaking to her editor. The Congresswoman could have pulled rank immediately, but she stood there, ready to accept the same treatment as any other citizen. The morning sun glinted off her press badge as she gestured animatedly, describing the scene. Social media platforms began buzzing with activity. A young law student who had been present for a different case had managed to post a detailed account of the events, careful to avoid any photographs in respect of court rules. His thread quickly gained traction, with thousands of shares within the first hour. A lesson in humility. Congresswoman chooses equal treatment in traffic court, read the first online headlines. The story resonated particularly well because it defied expectations. Here was a powerful political figure willing to accept consequences without pulling strings or demanding special treatment. Throughout the day, news vans lined the streets around the courthouse. Court officers found themselves fielding constant inquiries about the morning's events. Even Judge Chen's regular lunch spot, a small deli 2 blocks from the courthouse, was buzzing with discussions about what people were already calling the traffic court surprise. Several political commentators picked up the story by mid-afternoon. In an era where privilege and power often shield people from consequences, this Congresswoman's actions stand out, noted one respected analyst. She was prepared to pay a fine that many in her position would have avoided with a single phone call. The story gained additional depth as reporters dug into Congresswoman Mitchell's background. They discovered a consistent pattern of similar behavior. Instances where she had waited in regular lines, declined special treatment, and insisted on following the same rules as her constituents. Each revelation added another layer to the narrative. Inside the courthouse, the regular flow of cases continued, but there was an undeniable buzz in the air. Court staff shared knowing looks as they passed each other in the hallways. The young interns who had witnessed the event found themselves being questioned by colleagues from other departments, eager to hear first-hand accounts. By late afternoon, the story had evolved beyond a simple account of a traffic court surprise. It had become a talking point about leadership, humility, and the relationship between power and responsibility. News producers were already planning feature stories exploring these themes. "What makes this story particularly compelling," explained a media analyst, "is its authenticity. Neither the judge nor the Congresswoman was performing for cameras or seeking attention. It was a genuine moment of principle meeting practice." The sun was setting on Manhattan as the last reporters packed up their equipment outside the courthouse. The golden light caught the building's stone facade, creating long shadows that stretched across the steps, where, hours earlier, a simple traffic court session had transformed into something much more meaningful. Inside his chambers, Judge Chen found himself reflecting on the day's events as he prepared to head home. His phone had been buzzing with messages from colleagues, but he had chosen to wait until tomorrow to respond. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful moments deserve a little time to settle in before being discussed. Throughout the following weeks, the incident sparked meaningful discussions about public service and humility. Parents used the story to teach their children about treating everyone equally, while political commentators praised both the judge's consistent application of rules and the Congresswoman's modest character. Local schools began incorporating the incident into their civics lessons. Ms. Rodriguez, a high school teacher in Manhattan, used the story to illustrate the concept of equality under the law. Her students engaged in lively discussions about leadership and responsibility, with many sharing how the story had influenced their own thoughts about public service. What impressed me most, shared Emily Chen, a senior student, during a class presentation, was how Congresswoman Mitchell didn't just talk about equality, she lived it. She showed us that true leadership isn't about using power, but about setting an example. Her classmates nodded in agreement, many taking notes for their own civic engagement projects. The story continued to ripple through various communities. Local government offices reported an uptick in applications for public service positions. Young professionals cited the incident as inspiration for pursuing careers in public service, drawn to the idea that one could maintain integrity while holding positions of authority. Judge Chen found himself receiving invitations to speak at legal conferences about maintaining impartiality in the courtroom. Though initially reluctant to discuss the incident, he eventually agreed to share his insights, recognizing the valuable lessons embedded in the experience. The law must remain blind, he explained during one such conference, even when we ourselves are surprised by who stands before us. That morning reminded me that true justice doesn't peek through its blindfold to check credentials first. His words resonated with fellow judges and legal professionals across the country. Meanwhile, Congresswoman Mitchell's office noticed a significant increase in constituent engagement. People weren't just reaching out with complaints or requests. They were sharing their own stories of choosing integrity over convenience, inspired by her example. Her staff compiled these stories into a weekly newsletter, celebrating everyday acts of civic responsibility. Professional leadership programs began using the incident as a case study in their training materials. The power of humility in leadership became a popular workshop topic, examining how Mitchell's actions demonstrated the importance of leading by example rather than authority. Social media platforms saw the story evolve into various forms: memes, inspirational quotes, and even short educational videos. One particularly popular animation depicted the courtroom scene in a style accessible to younger audiences, helping parents explain concepts of equality and responsibility to their children. Local community groups organized discussion forums where citizens could share their thoughts about public service and civic duty. These conversations often expanded beyond the original incident to address broader questions about community involvement and personal responsibility. The story's impact reached beyond political and legal circles. Business leaders began examining their own practices regarding special treatment and privilege. Several corporate training programs added modules about maintaining humility in leadership positions, citing the traffic court incident as a primary example. As the weeks passed, the incident became less about the specific events of that morning and more about the larger principles it represented. Educational institutions, from elementary schools to law schools, found ways to incorporate its lessons into their curricula. Judge Chen's courtroom saw an interesting change as well. Regular attendees noticed a subtle shift in how people presented themselves. There seemed to be more emphasis on honest explanation and less on elaborate excuses. The incident had somehow transformed the atmosphere of even routine traffic court sessions. The morning sun still streamed through those same courthouse windows, but now it illuminated a space that had become something of a symbol. What happened there had touched a chord in people's hearts, reminding them that true leadership and justice aren't about power or position, but about character and principle. The story's most beautiful moment came during the annual State Leadership Conference, where Judge Chen and Congresswoman Mitchell shared a warm laugh over coffee. They discovered their shared passion for public service, leading them to establish a mentorship program helping young people understand both law and leadership. The conference hall buzzed with energy as attendees gathered for the morning session. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a warm atmosphere in the modern space. Judge Chen stood near the refreshment table, carefully stirring his coffee when he noticed Congresswoman Mitchell approaching with a gentle smile. "Your Honor," she greeted him warmly. "I believe we have a unique opportunity to share what we both learned that morning." Her coffee cup balanced delicately in her hands as she gestured toward two comfortable chairs in a quiet corner. The judge nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion. As they settled into their seats, the initial awkwardness quickly dissolved into genuine conversation. They discovered shared backgrounds. Both had grown up in working-class families, worked their way through school, and maintained a deep commitment to public service despite achieving positions of influence. "You know," Judge Chen reflected, his coffee now cooling slightly, "that morning in court taught me more about leadership than 15 years on the bench." His confession brought a knowing smile to the Congresswoman's face as she leaned forward, sharing her own perspective on the experience. Their conversation naturally evolved into a discussion about mentoring the next generation. Both had noticed a growing cynicism among young people about public service and the legal system. However, they also recognized how their unexpected courthouse encounter had sparked renewed interest in civic engagement. "Perhaps," Congresswoman Mitchell suggested, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm, "we could create something together, a program that helps young people understand both the legal system and public service from the inside." The judge found himself nodding before she even finished her thought. Over the next hour, they sketched out plans on conference notepads. Their vision took shape, a mentorship program that would pair high school and college students with legal and public service professionals. The program would emphasize practical experience alongside ethical leadership principles. By lunchtime, their informal coffee chat had transformed into a full-fledged proposal. Other conference attendees, noticing their animated discussion, stopped by to offer support and suggestions. The energy was infectious, and soon a small crowd had gathered, each person adding valuable insights to the developing program. "We'll call it Leadership Through Service," Judge Chen announced, writing the name at the top of his now full notepad. "A program that teaches young people that true leadership isn't about power or position. It's about service and integrity." Congresswoman Mitchell beamed her approval. Within months, the program launched as a pilot in 3 cities. Students spent time in courtrooms, legislative offices, and community service projects. They learned from professionals who, like Judge Chen and Congresswoman Mitchell, believed in the importance of humble leadership and equal justice. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Students emerged with a deeper understanding of civic responsibility and a renewed faith in public service. Many went on to pursue careers in law, government, and community leadership, carrying forward the lessons learned from that unexpected morning in traffic court. Judge Chen and Congresswoman Mitchell continued their collaboration, meeting regularly to guide the program's development. Their initial courthouse encounter had evolved into something neither could have predicted: a friendship based on shared values and a commitment to nurturing the next generation of public servants. As the sun set on another successful program graduation ceremony, both the judge and the Congresswoman couldn't help but marvel at how a simple traffic court incident had led to such meaningful change. Their story had come full circle, transforming from an awkward encounter into a lasting legacy of service and leadership.